So today we're going to be discussing the death penalty. The basic definition is capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, is a government-sanctioned practice whereby a person is put to death by the state as a punishment for a crime. Although that clear definition makes it sound straightforward, it is a very complex issue that many struggle to pick a clear stance on. While some people have a set opinion on the matter, many are stuck in a gray area, where they see reasoning for both sides. But first, we should talk about the early history of the death penalty. One of the earliest accounts of the death penalty goes all the way back to the 1700s BC, with King Hammurabi. King Hammurabi was the king of the Babylonian dynasty. He established the Code of Hammurabi, which has one of the first known death penalty laws. He had made 25 crimes punishable by death. These crimes were much less extreme than you would have expected. For example, adultery, which is cheating on a spouse, and helping slaves escape. This was odd because murder was not punishable with death. Although it is clear to me that these crimes should not result in death, it only brings up another question. How does society decide what is punishable by death? What is so bad that someone's life should be taken away? Either way, this does not line up with Hammurabi's views because he looked at justice with an eye for an eye view, meaning if a man destroyed someone's eye, then his eye should be destroyed as punishment. The question is, why wouldn't this principle apply to murder? This made it clear to me that even thousands of years ago, the death penalty was a confusing and complex topic just like it is today. Even though the ruler who had established the death penalty had made it himself, he was still confused on how to follow through with it. Moving on to early usage of the death penalty in America. This goes all the way back to colonial America. The first execution occurred in Jamestown colony of Virginia. In 1608, Captain George Kendall was sentenced to the death penalty for treason. He was a spy for Spain. Other crimes that were punishable by death at this time included rape, witchcraft, and murder. But soon after Captain George Kendall's execution, it became easier to be sentenced to death because in 1612, the governor of Virginia imposed something called the Divine, Moral, and Martial Laws. When enforced, these laws sentenced people to death for minuscule crimes like stealing grapes or killing chickens. I think it's safe to say that majority of today's society would look back on that and think they were out of their mind for killing someone for stealing grapes. This makes it clear that it is unacceptable to charge someone with the death penalty if they only committed a small crime. But does that make it acceptable for someone to face the death penalty for committing a larger crime? There are so many factors to consider. So now we're going to talk about crimes that are punishable by death. So a criminal can only be sentenced to death if they murdered a person. The Supreme Court had ruled that the death penalty could not be used for a crime if no death had occurred. In the past, one could be sentenced to death for crimes like rape or armed robbery, but then it was deemed unconstitutional. Some may wonder if the death penalty was unconstitutional in general. Well, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty is constitutional because it does not violate the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment prevents cruel or unusual punishment. But in order to follow the Constitution, it must be carried out in a certain manner following protocol. It is still undecided if someone can be sentenced to death for a government crime like treason. But what happens if there are multiple people involved in a crime where someone is murdered but not everyone participated in the murder? Well, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, many states allow criminals who did not physically murder someone but were present at the time of the murder to be sentenced to the death penalty. Although it's allowed, many states will not follow through with it. It doesn't happen often because the death penalty is reserved for the worst imaginable crimes, so they try and refrain from sentencing people who did not directly kill someone. Which states allow the death penalty? Majority of the United States allow the death penalty. To be exact, 28 states are for the death penalty, which leaves 22 against it. The U.S. military and government both allow the death penalty. Today I'm not going to be reading through every state that is for and against it, but it is easily found on the internet. So, moving on to my opinion. I'm for the death penalty. To be clear, I think that someone should only be sentenced to death if they commit a completely despicable crime. For example, serial killers and terrorists. The death penalty should only be given if there is no other suitable form of justice. The crime is so bad that going to prison is simply not enough. Before I researched this topic, I was actually against the death penalty. I formerly felt that rotting in prison is a more suitable punishment for heinous crimes. I had thought that it forced the criminal to suffer in jail and to live with a guilty conscience, and when it looked at it from this point of view, the death penalty seemed like an easy way out compared to life in prison. Multiple factors made me reconsider. A 2019 New York study found that it costs roughly $925 a day to imprison a criminal and $337,524 to imprison one person for a year. To me, it's a waste of money. Why should anyone pay this amount of money to care for someone who can only be described as evil? Although many people only think of prison as a place for punishment, it is also considered a place of rehabilitation. One of the ideas behind putting criminals in prison was that while locked up, they would learn from their mistakes and better themselves. I think this is a great concept for people who have only committed minor crimes. But we are talking about the worst criminals imaginable, and I don't think they are capable of bettering themselves, nor should they be given the opportunity. On the other hand, I could see why many people would be against or have mixed feelings regarding the death penalty. Sentencing someone to death is a big deal, and people have to make that decision. That is understandably a lot of responsibility for a person. And what if the person was wrongly accused? There are multiple cases where people have been wrongly accused for a crime and have not received proper justice until they have already wasted years of their life in jail. To avoid sentencing an innocent person to death, the death penalty should only be used if there's rock-hard evidence proving that the person is guilty. Obviously, this is easier said than done. To wrap up this discussion, I wanted to mention a poll I had made. I'd randomly asked a couple of friends whether they were for or against the death penalty. I ended up asking 8 people in total, and they all had similar opinions to the ideas I discussed earlier. All 8 people had said that they were for the death penalty, but only for specific circumstances. One thing I found after my research and discussions was that the more I talked about it, the more complex it became. The reason this is such a complicated topic is because people want justice to be served. Overall, the death penalty is a serious punishment that requires a lot of discussion before it can be determined if it is necessary.